I spent 15 years building a fashion empire on luxury and service, only to discover that my own employees were using my store as a front for a ruthless organized scheme. Now I'm standing in the wreckage of my life, realizing that the people I trusted weren't just thieves. They were waiting for the perfect moment to bury me. My store, the Gilded Thread, was more than just a boutique. It was a sanctuary of high fashion, a place where silk cost more than a month's rent, and the air smelled exclusively of expensive perfume and entitlement. I had spent 15 years building it from a tiny kiosk in the mall to a multi-million-dollar empire with flagship stores in the heart of the city. I prided myself on luxury, but more importantly, I prided myself on service. Or at least, I thought I did. It all started on a Tuesday, a day when the boutique was usually quiet, save for the regulars who came in to drop thousands on a whim. I was in my back office reviewing inventory when I heard a commotion near the front entrance. My manager, Brenda, a woman who wore her blonde hair in a severe bob that matched her equally severe attitude, was mid-sentence, her voice dripping with that polished, icy condescension she reserved for people she deemed not our clientele. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, sir," Brenda said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "We're currently closed for a private viewing." I frowned. We weren't closed. I checked the schedule again. It was a normal business day. I stood up, smoothing out my blazer, and walked toward the showroom floor. Through the glass partition of my office, I saw a man standing near the entrance. He was dressed in a simple, well-fitted hoodie and clean jeans. He didn't look like our usual crowd of sequin-clad socialites, but he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence that instantly caught my attention. "Ma'am, I have an appointment with the CEO, the man said. His voice was calm, steady, and entirely unfazed by Brenda's blatant hostility. Brenda let out a short, incredulous laugh. She signaled to Sarah, our newest floor assistant, who was hovering nearby, with a sneer plastered on her face. "Sarah, do you see this? He thinks he has an appointment. I told you, we don't allow solicitors in here. It's bad for the brand image." "I'm not a solicitor," the man repeated, still polite. "My name is Julian Thorne. I was invited here for a consultation regarding the winter gala procurement." My heart skipped a beat. Julian Thorne. He wasn't just some random customer. He was the primary contractor for our gala's interior design and logistical needs. I had been trying to get a meeting with him for 3 weeks. He was the biggest name in high-end event management, and he had finally agreed to drop by. I stepped out onto the floor, ready to apologize for the delay, but the scene before me froze my blood. Sarah had stepped in front of him, physically blocking his path, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "Look, honey," Sarah spat, not even bothering to hide the venom in her voice. "We've had enough of people like you trying to wander in here and touch the merchandise. This isn't a museum, and it's certainly not a place for loiterers. If you don't walk out of that door right now, I'm calling the police. I'm tired of dealing with people who think they can just stroll into a place they clearly don't belong." Brenda nodded in approval, checking her nails. "She's right, Mr. Thorne, or whatever your name is. We don't tolerate people who compromise our prestige. We have standards here, and it's very clear you don't meet them. You're making the real customers uncomfortable." Julian stood perfectly still. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He simply looked at Sarah, then at Brenda, and finally his gaze shifted toward me. His eyes were cold, reflecting a profound sense of disappointment that stung worse than any insult. "Is this the prestige you speak of, Brenda?" Julian asked, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent boutique. "Is this the standard you protect? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like nothing more than a front for something much uglier." I walked toward them, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Brenda turned, her face shifting from cold superiority to instant, sycophantic panic as she realized the CEO was standing right behind her. "Oh, Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. We were just dealing with—" I didn't let her finish. I walked past them, my eyes fixed on Julian. I extended my hand, my voice tight with a mix of fury and embarrassment. "Mr. Thorne, I am profoundly sorry. Please, ignore the incompetence you've just witnessed." I turned back to Brenda and Sarah, who were both suddenly very interested in the floorboards. "Brenda, clear your desk. Now." "Sir?" Brenda stammered, her face turning a sickly shade of pale. "What? Why?" "Because," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, You just made the single biggest mistake of your career. And what you don't realize is that I haven't just been losing money because of your attitude. I've been documenting everything. I gestured to the back office where my laptop was open. I've been recording the audio from the floor all morning, and I've been reviewing the security logs for the past 6 months. What I found isn't just about bad customer service. It's about a systematic effort to drive away anyone who didn't fit your twisted, narrow-minded worldview. And now I'm going to show you exactly what happens when you turn a boutique into a place of exclusion. I pulled out my phone and dialed the head of the company's internal security team. As the line rang, I looked at Brenda and Sarah, who were now trembling. I wasn't just going to fire them, I was going to make sure they never worked in this city again. But as the call connected, Julian reached out and touched my arm. "Wait, Marcus," he said, his face hardening. "It's worse than you think. I didn't come here just for the gala. I came here because I've been investigating your payroll records. Someone in this building hasn't just been discriminating against customers. They've been funneling money through an organized scheme, using the accounts of the people they were turning away to mask the theft." The color drained from my face. I looked at Brenda, who suddenly stopped trembling and met my eyes with a chilling, vacant smirk. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small device, and pressed a button. Suddenly, the store's alarm system screamed, and the automatic locks on the doors slammed shut, trapping us all inside. The silence that followed the alarm was deafening, punctuated only by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the lockdown system. Outside, the city traffic continued as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis, but inside the store the air grew thick and claustrophobic. Brenda stood by the control panel, her previous look of panic replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. She wasn't just a manager who had been caught being rude. She was a woman who had clearly spent months preparing for the moment her empire of secrets might be threatened. "Did you really think you were the only one watching the cameras, Marcus?" Brenda asked, her voice calm, almost detached. Sarah stood beside her. Her posture shifted from the haughty sneer of a floor assistant to something far more predatory. She reached into the underside of the service counter and produced a heavy, metallic object. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, but a localized signal jammer that instantly cut the power to our internal communication lines. "You pride yourself on being the visionary of this brand," Brenda continued, walking slowly toward us, her heels sounding like gunshots on the marble. "But while you were busy obsessing over couture gowns and quarterly profits, we were building something much more profitable. You see, an empty boutique is the perfect place to hide a ledger. We've been using your prestige to facilitate a network that moves far more than just luxury silk." My blood ran cold. I glanced at Julian, who remained perfectly composed, though his eyes were darting around the room, scanning for an exit or a tactical advantage. He whispered, "Marcus, don't move toward the main desk. They've rigged the proximity sensors. If you trigger the alarm again, they have a way to remotely scrub our secure server." "That's right," Sarah chimed in, her voice cold. "We've been redirecting funds through the profiles of the very people we filtered out of the store. Every time we turned someone away, we created a phantom account, a digital shadow that served our organized scheme. It's a perfect cycle, really. You get your diversity metrics for the board, and we get the capital to keep our side business running smoothly." I looked at my staff, people I had trusted with the keys to my life's work, and saw nothing but strangers. "You're talking about a massive fraud," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my veins. "The Service of Internal Security will have this place surrounded in minutes once they realize the connection to the server is dead." Brenda laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "The Service of Internal Security? You mean the department that's been on our payroll since the last audit?" "Oh, Marcus, you've been living in a dream world. The internal checks you've been relying on haven't been looking for theft. They've been looking for ways to finalize the transfer of the boutique's assets into our holding company." She pulled a tablet from her blazer and swiped across the screen. On the main showroom wall, the digital display that usually showcased our seasonal lookbook flickered and changed. It began scrolling through lines of transaction records, names, account numbers, and timestamps of massive sums being wired to offshore entities I didn't recognize. "This is the end of the line," she said, tapping the screen with a flourish. "By the time anyone figures out what happened here, the legal ownership of the gilded thread will be tied up in a web of shell corporations so complex it would take a decade to unravel. You'll be lucky if you aren't named in the attempt to frame you for this organized scheme." I felt the walls closing in. The reality of the situation was far more sinister than simple prejudice. I was being methodically erased from my own company. But just as Brenda moved to step behind the counter to initiate the final transfer, Julian caught my eye. He gave a subtle nod toward the rear fire exit, which was slightly ajar. "You think you've won, Brenda," Julian said, stepping forward, his voice projected with a sudden commanding authority. "But you made one fatal mistake. You thought the system was as rotten as you are. You didn't realize that I didn't come here to buy clothes. I came here under the direct request of the real owners, the investors who noticed the discrepancies months ago and installed a silent monitoring protocol in the building's foundations." Brenda paused, her finger hovering over the screen. "Investors? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your signal jammer isn't actually jamming anything," Julian said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous intelligence. "It's acting as a bridge, relaying all of your current activities directly to the regional office. And they aren't coming with a polite inquiry, Brenda. They're coming to arrest you and everyone involved in this organized scheme for fraud, embezzlement, and a massive list of felony charges." Brenda's composure finally shattered. Her face contorted with rage, and she lunged toward the main power console, her hand grabbing a heavy object from the display case to smash the interface. "If I'm going down, I'm taking the whole inventory with me." Suddenly, the front glass doors, the ones that had been locked tight, began to shake violently. It wasn't the police. It was the sound of something much heavier ramming into the frame from the outside. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw flashes of blue and red light reflecting off the pavement. But as the glass started to spiderweb and crack under the pressure of the impact, I realized the people outside weren't entering to save us. They were wearing black gear, their faces hidden behind tactical visors, and they were wielding heavy, illegal weapons meant for a siege. Brenda gasped, dropping her tablet. "They aren't the authorities," she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine terror. "They're the people we were working for, and they're here to tie up the loose ends." The glass didn't just break, it detonated, showering the marble floor in thousands of shimmering, lethal diamonds. Through the chaos, 3 figures stepped into the boutique, moving with the practiced, lethal precision of ghosts. They weren't police. They weren't even private security. They wore tactical gear that looked like it had been stripped from a military surplus warehouse, and in their hands they carried weapons that were clearly illegal in any civilized society. The air in the boutique shifted instantly. The smell of expensive perfume was choked out by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and fear. Brenda backed away from the console, her hands raised, her face drained of all color. I didn't mean to trigger the alert. I just wanted the money moved," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "We have the files. We have everything you need." The leader of the trio didn't respond. He simply scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the security cameras, then on us. He didn't care about Brenda's excuses. He was here to ensure that the organized scheme remained buried, and if that meant erasing everyone currently standing in the room, it was just part of the ledger. "Julian," I whispered, pressing my back against the cold, velvet-covered wall of a changing room. "Who are these people? If they aren't the authorities, and they aren't yours, who the hell are they?" Julian didn't look at me. His focus was entirely on the leader, his posture shifting into a defensive stance I hadn't realized he knew how to hold. "They are the enforcement arm of the syndicate that Brenda was feeding money to," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the store's ventilation system. "They aren't here for a conversation. They're here to make sure no one can testify to the internal audit the investors started." The leader moved toward the counter, his heavy boots crushing the shards of glass. He looked at the display, which was still scrolling through the illicit transactions. With one brutal motion, he grabbed the monitor and tore it from its mount, sending sparks showering into the air. He then turned his attention to us. "The boutique is closed," the leader said, his voice distorted through a mask. It was a cold, robotic sound that felt like a death sentence. Brenda tried to step forward, her voice trembling. "Wait, we can get you the rest of the funds. We have an account in the Cayman Islands that isn't connected to the server." The leader didn't let her finish. He swept his arm, and a secondary figure stepped forward, producing a set of zip ties. They weren't interested in the money anymore. They were interested in silence. They began to herd us toward the back of the store, toward the secure vault where the most valuable, and now most damning, inventory was kept. As we were shoved toward the back, I saw an opportunity. The display case nearest to me had been damaged in the initial impact. A heavy, silver display stand had tumbled onto its side, blocking the path of one of the men. I didn't think. I just moved. I tripped over the stand, sliding across the floor and behind the velvet curtains of the VIP changing room. "Marcus!" Julian shouted, a desperate move to draw their attention away from me. The sound of a heavy weapon being charged filled the room. It wasn't a warning shot. A deafening blast tore through the air, shattering a rack of dresses nearby. The room exploded in a frenzy of silk, feathers, and flying debris. I scrambled into the dark, narrow confines of the rear ventilation duct I had installed for fire safety years ago. It was a tight fit, and as I squeezed into the metal tunnel, I heard the men closing in. I was in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the muffled sounds of the store. I heard the scuffling of feet, the shouting of Brenda, and then a terrifying, absolute silence. "Check the perimeter," the leader commanded. "If the CEO isn't in this room, he's in the vents. Smoke him out." I started crawling, my nails tearing at the metal lining, heading toward the roof hatch. I had to get out. I had to reach the emergency transmitter I kept hidden near the HVAC unit. If I could activate it, I could call for a real internal investigation team, the kind that didn't just look at files but arrived with real force. But as I reached the end of the duct and pressed my hand against the lever for the roof hatch, the metal beneath me shuddered. A heavy hand slammed against the vent cover from the outside. Through the grate, I saw a face, a mask, staring directly into my eyes. "Found you," a voice rumbled. The grate was ripped away, and a gloved hand lunged into the dark, fingers clawing for my throat. I lashed out, catching the person on the wrist, but the grip was like iron. As I was dragged backward into the open air of the showroom, I saw the leader standing there, holding a tablet that was displaying a live feed of my own home address. "You think you're the hero of this story, Marcus?" the leader hissed, looming over me as he lifted his weapon. "You're not the hero. You're just the final transaction. And there's one more thing you should know. Your phone? It's not just calling for help. It's been transmitting your location to the very people you're trying to escape from. You haven't been hiding. You've been leading us exactly where we needed to go." He pulled the trigger, but there was a deafening metallic click. The weapon had jammed. In that split second of confusion, the back door of the store was kicked wide open, but it wasn't the police. It was a black sedan accelerating through the entrance and slamming into the center of the room, pinning the gunman against the display cases. The air was filled with dust and the smell of burning rubber. The driver's door opened, and a figure emerged, holding a badge that I recognized all too well. It was the head of the Internal Security Division, the one I thought was in on the scheme. And he was pointing his weapon, not at the gunman, but directly at me. The deafening silence that followed the crash was broken only by the hiss of the sedan's radiator and the groans of the pinned gunman. I lay on the floor, dazed, the shattered glass crunching under my weight. The man from the Internal Security Division, Director Vane, walked toward me with a calm, predatory grace. His weapon remained steady, leveled at my chest. Brenda, meanwhile, was scrambling toward him, her face a mask of desperate relief. "Director, you're finally here. Get them away from me. They were trying to steal everything," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Julian and me. Vane ignored her completely. He walked right past her, his gaze locked on the leader of the gunmen, who was struggling to crawl out from under the wreckage of the sedan. Vane reached down, pressed the barrel of his sidearm against the man's tactical mask, and whispered something I couldn't hear. The man stopped moving instantly, his body going rigid, as if he'd been paralyzed by the words. "Brenda," Vane said, not turning his head. "You really were the worst part of this entire organized scheme. You were loud, you were messy, and you were remarkably easy to track." Brenda froze. What do you mean?" Vane finally turned to look at her, his expression one of utter boredom. "Did you honestly think the Service of Internal Security was in on your little operation? We allowed this circus to continue for months because we needed you to keep funneling the illicit funds into a single verifiable digital vault. You were the bait. And today, you finally tripped the wire." The air in the room felt like it was shifting. Julian, who had been pinned against the wall, slowly stood up, brushing plaster from his blazer. He didn't look like a terrified victim anymore. He looked like a man who had been holding a winning hand all along. He walked over to me and offered a hand, helping me to my feet. "Director Vane, I assume you have the backup from the cloud?" Julian asked. Vane nodded, and suddenly the store's emergency lights flickered to a steady, authoritative blue. From the shattered front entrance, real tactical units, the kind that answered to the National Oversight Committee, poured in, moving with a speed that made the previous gunmen look like amateurs. They didn't just detain the criminals, they systematically swept the building, securing the servers and the ledger files. Brenda looked around, her world crumbling in real time. "You used me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You let me do it all so you could pin the entire organized scheme on me." "You did it to yourself, Brenda," I said, stepping forward. My anger had been replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "You were so obsessed with status and prestige that you didn't notice the foundations of your own life were made of sand. You thought you were smarter than everyone else because you could bully people and manipulate accounts. But you forgot that greed is the loudest signal in the world." The officers moved in, zip-tying Brenda and Sarah. They didn't fight back. The sheer weight of the evidence being pulled from the servers, the recordings, the transaction logs, the proof of their attempts to ruin lives for their own profit, had drained them of their last bit of defiance. As they were dragged out of the boutique, I saw the genuine terror in their eyes. They weren't just losing their jobs. They were facing an enormous, insurmountable term of incarceration for their actions. Vane turned to me, his tone shifting from professional to almost apologetic. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize for the theatrics. We needed to be absolutely certain we had the entire network, from the street-level enforcers to the architects of the payroll fraud. The boutique will remain under our control for the next few days for the final sweep, but legally your name is cleared. You're no longer a person of interest." "And the investors?" I asked. "The investors are very pleased," Julian said, stepping up beside me. "They were looking for a CEO who wouldn't sacrifice his integrity for a quick profit, and someone who would fight to fix the rot when it was discovered. They've authorized a complete restructuring of the Gilded Thread. We're going to rebuild this place, and this time it's going to be for everyone." As the last of the police units left, the boutique was quiet again, save for the sirens fading in the distance. The store was a wreck, filled with dust and broken glass, but for the first time in years, the air felt clean. I walked over to the front entrance, stepping over the threshold that had been the site of so much exclusion. I thought about the people Brenda and Sarah had turned away, people who were just as worthy of respect and luxury as anyone else. That would change. "Julian," I said, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker to life, "tomorrow we start over, and we make sure that the door stays open for everyone. The downfall of the boutique's staff hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a necessary clearing of the field. I realized then that I hadn't just saved my business, I had saved my soul. The Gilded Thread would be rebuilt, not on the backs of the people we turned away, but on the principles of trust and access. And as I turned back to lock the doors for the final time, I knew that the story of this boutique would be one of redemption, not greed. The nightmare was over, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright, inclusive, and entirely, authentically mine.